Welcome back to the programme. The government's extradition policy is under scrutiny once more as radical cleric Abu Qatada appeals to the European Court of Human Rights. Let's just catch up with recent events in this story.
The European Court of Human Rights announced on Monday that 5 terror suspects in the UK could be extradited to the United States. The suspects include the high-profile case of Abu Hamza, who is wanted by the US for allegedly planning to establish a terrorist training camp in Oregon.
There is no question that Abu Hamza is a very dangerous man and that successive governments have been trying to remove him. That's why I warmly welcome the decision that has been taken today. There is no question that he should be extradited to the United States.
Another of the suspects to be extradited is Baba Ahmed. After 8 years in jail, Ahmed is one of the longest-held people in Britain detained without trial. He is accused of running a jihadist website in London that supported terrorism, but can be tried in the USA because the website was hosted by a company in Connecticut. The men are being denied their right to be tried in a British court. Many prominent figures have campaigned for Baba Ahmed, a British citizen, to be prosecuted in the UK. Controversy was sparked after it was revealed material seized by the police from Ahmed's home was not given to the British Crown Prosecution Service, but rather passed secretly to American authorities.
For me to respond to all of the allegations against me is in a court of law, and that is why I call upon the Crown Prosecution Service to put my heart at rest and to put everyone else's heart at rest, and please put me on trial in this country.
While Abu Hamza and fellow suspect Khalid Al-Fawaz have won a slight delay preventing their immediate extradition, Ahmed and the other 2 men may be sent to the USA any day now.
In the studio to reflect on these issues are Professor Bill Baring from Birkbeck College and Maqbool Javid from Caged Prisoners. On the phone is Ted Broman, Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Welcome to the programme. I mean, now there's a series of very different cases under consideration here, Bill. What do you think brings them all together in terms of what the government is doing with its extradition policy and with its attitude towards the European Court for Human Rights?
Well, the cases that you were just mentioning, the problem there is the very one-sided extradition treaty between Britain and the United States. And I think many people are concerned about that for a variety of reasons. And I think the point you heard a moment ago made by Baba Ahmed, that if there is evidence against him here, then he should be tried here, I think has a lot of strength. The issue there is not so much, I think, with the European Court of Human Rights as it was in Abu Qatada's case, of course.
So, what do you think the government is doing that it shouldn't be doing in these cases?
Well, I would echo what Bill said. I mean, I think that they're using a treaty which is extremely one-sided, which allows the Americans to make a request for individuals that they assert have committed offences. They don't have to show a case or, put evidence forward, make the request more or less. And also, given the sort of media onslaught against certain of the individuals, I mean, Abu Hamza in particular, here's an individual who has been caricatured. Richard Littlejohn is on record as saying if there wasn't, Abu Hamza didn't exist, you would create a villain like him with no arms, hooks and one eye, this sort of pirate individual. So he's pilloried. And the government is flexing its muscle, showing that, we want to get rid of these people and not providing them with due process. I mean, they've been locked up for, horrendous amount of time with no questioning, no charges being brought against them. And as Bill said, particularly in Baba Ahmed's case, here's an individual, government says, he says that if he committed offences in this country, he should be tried here, and it shouldn't be for the Americans to try him because he's never been to America.
I mean, Ted, let me just bring you in on this. Ted Broman from the Heritage Foundation. I mean, isn't it a pretty elementary principle that if somebody's committed a crime in this country, they should be tried in this country and not extradited to your country?
Well, I would point out that the U.S.-UK extradition treaty is perfectly balanced on this point, and in fact, it's perfectly balanced on all points. Both the previous speakers have said the treaty is unbalanced or unfair to Britain. This is untrue. The treaty is perfectly reciprocal. The U.S. has extraterritorial privileges in cases only where the United Kingdom can claim extraterritoriality in similar cases. So to put that in concrete terms, if there were a reverse case and there was someone in the United States who had hosted or run a website through the United Kingdom would have exactly the same right to extradite that individual as the U.S. does in this case.
Bill, so what is the problem then? Ted seems to say there isn't one.
Well, I think there's a pretty fair preponderance of opinion in this country that, number one, this treaty was designed for purposes of terrorism. So one could say the case we're just discussing is the right kind of case. But it is a fact that there have been really cases which have attracted a lot of attention of economic charges, for example. And I think whatever Ted says about the perfect balance of the treaty, it seems to be a fact that there are a large number of British people being extradited to the United States. And we hear of case after case, and we don't hear of any Americans being extradited to Britain.
Paul, what do you agree with that there is an imbalance in the treaty?
No, there's a consensus that there is an imbalance. I mean, all academics accept, and practicing lawyers accept there is an imbalance, and the Americans rightly are asserting their right to ensure that their citizens have to go through a process before they're extradited to any country. Unfortunately, the UK government seems to have taken a very laid-back position, and as Bill said, we've had the NatWest 3 who were extradited. We've got Gary McKinnon, someone suffering from Asperger's syndrome who is alleged to have, engaged in hacking activities. And there are other individuals who have gone on this one-way street to the US, but nothing comes back the other way because the Senate has made it clear that they're not going to allow any country to extradite US citizens unless there is, evidence and a strong case against them. It doesn't happen the other way. I mean, Abu Hamza is alleged to have sat in Finsbury Park or wherever and conspired to set up a training camp in Oregon, the USA. I mean, is that believable? And the evidence that's been submitted is very scant, is based on the testimony of an individual who has turned supergrass, and that's all it takes. So an individual can say that any three of us have been engaged in some conspiracy, swear a subpoena, go through the process, and then simply the US government makes a request, and we have to be put onto a plane and taken there, and there's nothing we can do. That cannot be right.
So Ted, it's perfectly balanced in theory, but as a matter of fact, the flow is only one way over the Atlantic. So there must be some problem, at least in practice, surely.
No, I disagree entirely with that. First, if you go back to extraditions in the 60s and the early 70s, long before the current treaty, you will find exactly the same proportion of people being extradited to and from Britain and the United States. The ratio has not changed. The U.S. is a much larger country, has a much larger economy, is much more populous. It's not surprising that the U.S. has authority over more cases, including more cases that require extradition, than the United Kingdom does. And as for the point that there is no legal process behind this, why do you think that these cases have taken so long to extradite? The reason they take so long to extradite is because there is an incredible legal process with multiple layers of defense. And that is why so many of these individuals have extradition cases that drag on forever and ever. Finally, I really have to protest against the idea that this treaty was about terrorism. This extradition treaty replaced the previous treaty and replaced the one before that, all of which were comprehensive treaties explicitly intended to deal with all offenses that are offenses under both British and American law. This was never a terrorism treaty. It was never intended simply to deal with 9/11. It was and it remains a comprehensive treaty for everything. Terrorism, financial fraud, child pornography, murder, and any other kind of criminal offense.
Ted, I'm a little bit lost on one of your points there, where you say America's a very big country and Britain's a much smaller country, and therefore you would expect there to be more extraditions from Britain to America. Surely common sense would dictate exactly the opposite. There's very few British citizens in comparison to American citizens, so why on earth are they disproportionately being extradited that way over the Atlantic?
let me put it this way. The U.S. is going to have jurisdiction over many more cases, most of which, of course, will involve American citizens, the vast majority of them, than British authorities will have. There are fewer cases of criminal behavior in the United Kingdom because there are fewer people. It's natural, therefore, that the U.S. is going to have more extradition cases to file. And, in fact, it does have more extradition cases to file. Nothing has changed about the ratio of cases from the old system to the new system. If you go back to 1963 to 1973, you will find 28 extraditions from the United Kingdom and only 3 from the United States. That is exactly the same ratio as has occurred under the new treaty. So I find it a little curious that people are saying the flow is one way. First of all, it's not one way. But secondly, the ratio has not changed.
So is it simply a maths failure on my part, Bill, or is there something wrong with this argument?
Well, I think that is one point which is wrong. I think there's also the point that Maqbool has been making as to the degree of process as to substance which is required in the United States as opposed to here. When Ted says that cases go on for a long time in this country, when they go on for a long time, it's because of procedural points. But there is a common problem with extradition under the European Extradition Treaty and under the European Arrest Warrant, that the British courts simply cannot get to grips with whether there is any evidence. They are excluded from doing that. I do quite a lot of work in relation to extradition requests from Russia, for example, and the court is not able to look at the substance of the charges against the individuals whose extradition is sought. And so I think that point is not being properly looked at either.
So what you're saying is that actually when it comes to an extradition hearing here, not all the evidence is actually in front of the court?
So none of the evidence. No. So the court does not look into the evidence at all. The only way that the subject of the extradition request succeeds is by showing that there's an improper political motivation for the request. But the court cannot look into whether or not there are actually grounds for charging this person with the offence.
So, I think that is what lies at the heart of this particular issue. The judges here do not have the power or ability to pick apart the case that is made against the individuals. They are not there to determine the facts, the strength of the allegations. It's very superficial. Ted makes the point about delay. The delay came about because the assertion made by all these individuals was that to be extradited would involve a breach of their human rights. They would be put into inhumane or degrading conditions. And that the penal system that operates within the United States, particularly the supermax prisons, are managed in such a way that it would be inhumane to put individuals in there where you are, kept in solitary confinement for most of the day, and people in solitary confinement for years. 150 scholars, mostly from the US, filed evidence with the European Court of Human Rights pointing out that the evidence provided by the US government about the supermax regime was incorrect. The Americans weren't willing to provide information about how prisoners are treated. They provided a sample, and as I said, 150 academics said that the system is oppressive, that people are treated in a way which is totally not acceptable. So, whilst people get hot under the collar about the fact that, regimes in certain parts of the world run a penal system which is oppressive and degrading, these scholars are saying, academics, reputable ones, are saying that the way prisoners are treated in the US, in the supermax environment, is horrendous. Solitary confinement, punishments meted out for instance, in relation to Muslim prisoners, because they speak Arabic. And Ted knows very well about the evidence that concerns racism within the system itself and the numbers of African Americans who are on death row. And unfortunately, the European Court of Human Rights didn't accept that argument, and it was because it was a political decision. They could not come to terms with the fact that if the claimants were right in what they were saying, that it would render the US penal system as being one that no that wouldn't protect fundamental human rights, and they shied away from it and didn't take that decision, even though there's considerable amount of evidence which shows that prisoners are treated in an appalling manner, in a manner which would not be acceptable within the European sort of area at all.
Mm. So Ted, presumably that's an argument which you would accept, certainly for American citizens, that they shouldn't be extradited to countries whose prison and justice system falls below a certain acceptable standard, and so it must apply universally.
I have no difficulty with Americans being extradited to Britain, provided that the proper procedures are being followed, and I would say the exact same for Britons to the United States. I think the only unwillingness to accept reality here is the unwillingness to accept the reality that the European Court of Human Rights looked at the evidence and found that American prisons, including supermax prisons, frequently have better conditions than prisons in Europe. I would point out that Britain practices solitary confinement and has defended its practice of solitary confinement. So in that regard, the United States is no different from the United Kingdom. More broadly, the idea that the United States is a hideous, oppressive, nasty kind of place to which people cannot or should not be extradited on human grounds is a base appeal to anti-American sentiment justified by a political desire to put the U.S. in the wrong. It is not in accord with the U.S.-UK treaty. It is not in accord with the reality of the United States as a mature democracy with an open and fair legal and judicial system, which stands good comparison with the United Kingdom's, and it is not in reality with the fact that the U.S.-UK treaty provides ample safeguards for individuals going both directions. Both of our guests here today have said the treaty is unfair. I would point out that the U.S. standard of evidence is that of probable cause. The U.K. standard is that of reasonable suspicion, and contrary to what we hear repeatedly in the British press, the Baker Review, led by Sir Scott Baker, has found that these standards are, within the limits of our different systems, compatible, similar, and intended to be compatible and similar in their basic approach. So we hear a lot that the treaties are wildly unfair and unbalanced, that the U.S. is a terrible and oppressive place. But this does not accord with the facts. It doesn't accord with the findings of a senior judge who researched the treaty very carefully. I agree it accords with the view of a lot of people in the United Kingdom who have been enthusiastically propagandized on this point, but it does not accord with the facts.
Okay. So, Bill, are you a victim of propaganda, or is there a factual base to your argument?
I think, first of all, we must not lose sight of the most important point, which is that the courts here cannot look at the substance of the allegations. So, and I think Ted was doing a good job just now of diverting us from that issue. I think on the question of human rights standards, there is what lawyers call a very high threshold. It is actually extremely difficult to persuade the court, even with Russia, for that matter, that there are violations of such a scale that it's not possible to extradite somebody. And there was one case quite a few years ago called Suring against the United Kingdom, where the court stopped the United Kingdom from extraditing somebody to the United States, where that person was going to be possibly subject to a death penalty and being on death row. And that was only because the particular very vulnerable psychological state of the individual concerned meant that that person would suffer inhuman and degrading treatment if on death row. And the United States then had to deal with that in order to get extradition. But that really is just about the only case. So I mean, the issue, just to repeat, is not being able to get to grips with what the allegations actually are.
Yes, I mean, I think this is not anti-Americanism. No one is saying that the United States is an oppressive country in all its sort of activities. What is being said is that the way that prisons are run, the penal system, is managed in a way which is not acceptable. And Ted knows very well one of the main differences, is the death penalty. The European Court will never extradite anyone who's going to face the death penalty. And in this particular case, undertakings had to be given by the United States government that these individuals wouldn't face the death penalty. And the point is not just for these individuals, but for US citizens themselves. We all must want a penal system where people are not incarcerated for long periods of time, held in solitary confinement, and then punished in a way which is not acceptable. You know, the numbers of individuals, the proportion of the population that's in prison is frightening in the United States. You know, you have 3 strikes and out, you have all kinds of approaches and tactics, you have private companies running prisons, it's outsourced. You know, the state absolves itself of the responsibility by getting private companies that are only motivated by profit. Now, that as a principle is something that European countries would find hard to accept. So it is out of concern for US citizens and citizens from any other country in the world. It's not an anti-Americanism. What we are saying is that the penal system is not being run in a way which is ought to be acceptable and is not in accordance with prevailing human rights standards, and many individuals have said that, not only in terrorism cases, in financial cases, and US academics themselves. As Ted knows, he may see them as being part of this anti-American conspiracy, but it is out of genuine concern for a country which holds itself out as being the champion of human rights. It ought to run a penal system which is not oppressive and degrading and inhumane.
Okay, well, let me just bring you back to the case that I started off in the introduction to, because Peter Oborne, who's a Tory supporter, writing in the Daily Telegraph, has said that the reaction to the appeal to the European Court of Human Rights by Abu Qatada is bringing the British justice system into disrepute, because it's no longer willing, as he sees it, to defend the rights of the underdog, the excluded, however unpopular or unpleasant we might think they are, they have the right to a fair trial. So we've been talking about the failings of the American system, but here's somebody right at the heart of the British establishment who says that there's something wrong with the British system as well. Do you agree, Bill?
I mean, I think in Britain we suffer from, for example, by far the highest incarceration rate of anywhere in Western Europe. We have a prison system bursting at the seams. We have very serious problems of delays and that kind of thing. We have a very unfortunate history of miscarriages of justice. And I think the history of Britain's relations with the European Court of Human Rights is that in a whole series of cases, actually things have been made better here by virtue of judgments at Strasbourg. I do think the Abu Qatada case, which we're not discussing as such today, was completely misrepresented in the British press. And actually the issue there was whether one could send him to a country where he might be tried on the basis of evidence obtained by torture when you could not use such evidence in this country. Seemed to me to be perfectly straightforward, but it was just blown out of all proportion in a very misleading way by the media.
I mean, in many ways, it's exactly the same issue, though, isn't it? What are the grounds which make extradition acceptable? And extraditing someone to a judicial system which doesn't have elementary safeguards in place is unacceptable.
Precisely. I mean, and that's the point that's been made in these cases, and that's why there's been this delay. You know, as I said, if you look at the individuals, you've got Khalid al-Fawaz, Abdullah al-Bari, who are not UK citizens, who have been held without charge for 14 years. I mean, that is just mind-blowing. 14 years, no one's questioned them. Allegations have been made against them. They've been separated from the families, held in very kind of difficult conditions. Abu Hamza, at the end of the day, if you strip away the Richard Littlejohn pirate image, is a disabled man who suffers from diabetes, extremely ill, and who is alleged, as I say, to have conspired to set up a training camp in Oregon, been involved in some kidnapping in Yemen, and because it's so highly politicised, the courts can't intervene.
Well, I'm going to have to stop you there. Thanks very much for watching, but we've run out of time. Do join us again for the next edition of the Politics and Media programme.